Hey, this week in the 167, we're talking about one of our core values, which is service, which we say save people, serve people. Welcome to the 167.
1, 2, 3, let's go!
Hey, welcome back to the 167. We are here with our new series, What's in It for Me?
Yes,
What's in it for me?
well, that's what we're trying to figure out. I don't really know.
I'll tell you what's in it for you. You get to hear us talk about this in the 167 for half an hour and be blessed.
And that's a beautiful thing.
That's right. So we were talking a little bit about our core values, what it means to be New Life. I love series like this because, it makes my job easier when I go to teach step 1. We talk about our core values and what those mean to us. Just out of curiosity, can either of you name all 5 core values off the top of your head?
Yes.
I always get 4 out of 5 and get stuck. Our
You
core values
you got to
are
do them in order every time, or you get
service,
lost.
save people, serve people,
Yeah,
fellowship, we church, not me church,
yeah.
evangelism. You're going to say it?
Oh, the catch line?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Growing people
An empty,
change.
No,
Yeah.
an empty seat is a serious matter.
No,
Oh.
that's
the catch
evangel-
line.
That's it. That's
Discipleship.
evangelism.
Discipleship, growing people change,
Yeah,
and worship.
Yeah.
it's not just singing.
It's
It's
Sacrifice.
sacrifice.
We got it.
there you go. Between the three
go
of us, I like for real. Every time I'll name 4 of them, and it will be a different 4 every time. And then I start going, which ones did I say? I always miss it. But those are
And
our
they're on
5
the front
core
of
ones.
the bulletin now. So,
Yes.
But this week, that is a great bulletin. Good job, Ryan.
Hey,
If
Yeah,
you
he
enjoy the
decided-
new bulletin cover, Ryan Ellis, everybody.
smash that like button.
Yeah. Hit the bell.
Ding, ding.
Ding.
So this week we were talking about service. And we were talking about having a servant's heart, being a servant, not just a volunteer. So I just want to start out by asking you guys, what was something in your walk that was a transformative time that you were serving? So like, what were you doing and how did it change you?
For me, it's a it's a simple no-brainer right out of the gate. I can just so you got to rewind the tape in my life. 30 years or so, Trudy and I were looking for a church home for our family. We walked into a church that we didn't know much about. Not even sure how we learned of this church. I believe it was through they had a marriage conference or something that we had become aware of. And anyway, so we show up and felt at home at that church. I was not in full-time ministry. I had a career that I had been working in this place for, at that time, probably 5 or 6 years. And so we just looking for a church for our family to go to, enjoyed that church, fell in love with that church, and made a decision within the first several weeks that we need to find a place to serve. This is our church home. We need to get involved and serve. And we started asking around and was introduced to a couple who led what we would call our first impressions team. And they said, "Oh, we would love to have you be part of our greeter team." And so we said, "Perfect. Like, tell us what to do." And so they assigned us to be part of their welcome team at the doors and greet people. And then about 2 or 3 weeks into us serving there, they came and said, "Hey, we got transferred. We're moving to Texas," I think is where they were moving to.
Everybody moves to
And
Texas.
you guys we're new to the church. I said, "You guys are awesome. And we're going to suggest that they put you in charge of this ministry." And we're like, "What in the world?" And so we were approached and said, "Hey, would you guys coordinate this?" And we prayed and said, "Sure." And just made ourselves available. So we were faithful servants in that ministry, and we served in that ministry for a few years, and then it expanded, and they asked us to coordinate life groups and develop that. We didn't have any kind of small group ministry. So Trudy and I began to develop the life group ministry at that church, and we poured ourselves into that and made ourselves available to do whatever. And long story made even longer. So you fast forward, then probably 8 years later, I was asked to join their staff as a pastor. And so I quit my vocational job where I was my career and pursued the calling that God had placed on my life into full-time ministry. And yeah, the rest of is history.
All because you shaking hands at the
Yeah,
front door.
just because I said, "What do you need us to do?" And they said, "Hey, would you
telling
do
you.
this?"
First impressions it's the gateway drug to serving. Everybody that comes in, they're like, I want to serve. I don't know where. I'm like, just start in first impressions, and then we'll take it from there.
So
Yeah.
if we would have said, we're not going to serve anywhere, like we would have never been on that track of pursuing God more purposefully into what it means for us in deeper ministry. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Ryan?
For me, it's actually, mine is not what I did personally, but I saw it modeled as a servant behavior through my parents. Like I said previously, I was blessed enough to that whenever I came along in the world, my parents had already started attending church. They were new believers, but my dad held a factory job forever, and mom was just para here and there teaching sign language and doing that stuff. So they were never employed at the church. They didn't go to church their whole life, but once they started, they really modeled that service behavior, and I just saw that growing up and how important it was to them. And my dad always sang on the worship team, and they always helped with youth or children's ministries, and so it just became a part of my lifestyle once I was old enough to do that, again serving on the worship team, playing instruments. And then the second part as an adult, sort of whenever we were moving up to the Kansas City area, finding out what we were going to do. And my wife, she's an amazing volunteer servant, and she just was always available for whatever was going on, and just again modeling that in front of me and in front of our children and stuff. So I always say, whenever you have kids around you, or even people who are adults, they're watching you, everything you do, that rubs off on people, and you make a good impression with that, and they're
I especially think if you're modeling that as an adult, it rubs off on your kids.
Yeah.
Like my kids just know we're at the church all the time. Like if there's going to be an event, we are volunteering.
Yeah, and you don't bring that like, we have to be at the church again. There's a lot of people, a lot of comedians that talk about that. Like, we were at the church Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Like, we want, if you're not here, and I know we're going to talk about that later, but like this should be a thing of joy for you to be able to serve and
Yeah.
exactly.
volunteer.
I think one of my earliest ones was like I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor, but it was that reminder to me, and I think it stuck with me every time somebody is kind of like, they kind of had that attitude of like, I'm a real mature Christian. I want some more meat, or what, it becomes about them. I'm just like, because I got kicked out of Sunday school when I was like 12 because I was a jerk, but I was cocky, and I was just like, I don't, whatever the Sunday school teacher was teaching, I already knew. I was a pastor's kid, and so I just wasn't paying attention, and we got into an altercation because he was taught a whole Sunday school lesson about how if you substitute words, like if you say the word sucks instead of a cuss word, it's just the same thing. And I was like, would you show that to me in the Bible? I was just like, kind of in his face about it. And he asked me he's like, do you want to teach? I was like, sure. And so I came back later and taught. And so he was livid and went to my dad, and my dad's like, you think you're hot stuff and you think you can teach? Okay. And he put me in charge of the 3 and 4s class. So he moved me downstairs. Like I got kicked out of Sunday school, and instead of like punishing me, he put me in a place of leadership, because he was like, you think you're hot stuff, you
Yeah.
need to go serve. If you think this is beneath you, like, then you need to go serve. And it, like, teaching 3s and 4s is very humbling.
Yeah, toddlers will humble you.
Yeah, there was a kid that he used to sit there and like hit his head against the wall, and I'd have to like sit with him. And so it was the first time where I was really challenged, I think, to do that. And so that stuck with me, because every time now somebody at church comes and like, oh, the Sunday morning message, I'm just like, okay, where are you serving? Like,
Yeah.
if this is beneath you, let's get you serving,
Yeah.
But, and you and I both kind of mentioned it in us. And I think it's funny because all of these stories for us end in, we are in full-time ministry. And so one of the points that you were making to people, which I think is really good, is that your calling is not always your occupation or your career. And a lot of people, especially if you don't work for the church, like it's this, yes, I work at the bank. Yes, I work at QT. Yes, I work here, but that's not my calling that God's put on my life. It is, maybe it's evangelism in that space, but you're not called to be,
Right.
a banker. That just happens to be your vocation while you live out the calling of God. But I think it would be interesting for our listeners to know what is the difference between your calling and your career. Like you're the senior pastor, you're the experience director, I'm the discipleship pastor. Those are our careers. But what was the calling that God put on your life?
Yeah. So for me, when I got saved late in high school, as a late teenager, not growing up in church, when I got saved, started going to church, like I knew very early, I can't even put it into words exactly, but I knew my life was not going to be just show up on Sunday and go home. Like I knew. And so I was looking for places where I could be of benefit, that I could serve, that I could do whatever needed to be done in a ministry context, whether in the church or in ministry outside of the church. And so when there was something that came up, I was like, well, I can do that. Like, and so I just knew that. I think, like, I don't have any definitive way to prove it, but I think that was the beginning of God calling me to a little deeper. It wasn't like a one-time revelation from here to there. It was, hey, I have something for you. Take a step out into the water a little bit. And so I just began serving and pursuing him. And then he called a little deeper and then called a little deeper. So for the first 15 years of Trudy and my marriage and our family, I had a job that I went to. I was in the food distribution, warehousing, transportation, started off loading trucks, got promoted. That was my career. And I worked hard at my career, and I went from picking orders to loading trucks to supervising a crew to the transportation side. And I was on a career path, and that career was how God provided the income and the insurance and the benefits and the 401k and all the stuff that took care of our family so we could go and do ministry. And so I worked about 45 to 50 hours a week in my career, and then we served another 15 hours or so a week on top of that at the church. And we did that for 8 to 10 years until then I was offered a full-time position. And then, I mean, they said, I know you've been in this career for a long time, and it's going to be a cut in pay. We don't have 401k. We don't have the kinds of benefits they have, but we're offering this to you. And like, it didn't take long. We prayed and knew that this is God calling me even deeper still into what he has for me. Mm-hmm. And so again, for me, it was not I woke up one day and God said, hey, here's your calling.
Your coffee table was on fire and it didn't burn up?
Yeah, it was a continual calling into deeper and deeper waters, and then ultimately to, this is what I have for you. So that's my story.
Yeah. Well, and like, I think for me, it's, you know, I've served so many different roles. So like, I went to Bible college. I came out and did 2 years of youth ministry, which included running a children's ministry kind of vicariously through staff. And I did that for a while. And then I was in creative arts for almost 10 to 12 years doing that. And now I'm doing discipleship. And for me, I used to think that my calling was teaching, where it's like, you know, I like teaching. It doesn't matter what it is. You know, there was a brief period where I wasn't working for any church. And what I did was substitute teaching, and I loved it. I like teaching people about the Bible. I love doing that. But more and more, I've realized that I think that my calling, because it's what I've done no matter what I was in, is investing in training up leaders. So like my first youth ministry, I went in there and we grew very, very quickly. And I was like, at the time, you know, it was one of those things where like nobody was doing it except for like Doug Fields, where he was like, no, you got to raise up leaders and call them youth pastors and get, you know, like, and it was just like, just delegate this, you know, thing, and like apprentice and do this stuff. And I just did it out of force of, you know, need. And then I took a job at my dad's church and started to really lean into that, got my master's. And it's just like, that's what I love doing. Is it doesn't really matter if I'm doing discipleship or creative arts, because even when I was a creative arts director, I was not. Like I have a wife who's amazing at singing and leading and my brother is, you know, musically savant. And the only reason I was able to succeed as a you know, music director, a, you know, creative arts director was because I just surrounded myself with people and, you know, believed in them and invested in them. And then they kind of carried on the ministry. Same thing with life group leaders. You know, that's all you can do is invest in the leader,
Yeah.
which breeds healthier groups. So I always feel like my calling is investing in building up leaders. And whether it's my career right now is discipleship, but you know, that's just, I don't feel like that's my calling. I feel like my calling is that investment piece.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, for those who may be watching or listening that they're kind of struggling with that, like, you know, being in that place where like I'm so miserable in what I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have this. We use the word a lot. I have this passion, you know, to do this.
Right.
So for me, it was always to do music. I just wanted to be a rock star. I wanted to be on stage playing my music, doing my thing, traveling. And so really, if I peel the layers back on that onion, you know, my passion was to lead people, right? I love the music part of it, but it was really just to lead people. And I kind of see that in your
You're
story.
like in that response of like the other band members, or you want to lead people like
Yeah,
the
just-
audience in worship.
Just captivate audiences,
Yeah.
lead people. And kind of, you know, in your guys' story again, just I see that kind of aspect. So I think for the people who are struggling with that, like, what am, you know, is this my calling? And, you know, what is my passion? I think, you know, our calling is always to worship, to reflect God back and to minister to God and to get as many others as along the way that we can to do the same. And so I would always just encourage you, like, if you're in a place where you are feeling like you are miserable where you're at and that you have this passion, like, encourage you to bring it to one of us, to your leaders, and say, hey, this is where my heart is, this is where my passion is, and we can kind of help maybe dissect that a little bit and plug you into a place where shaking hands at the front door and 20 however, well, 30
yeah,
40 30 years later, you're leading a church of other people who are going to lead people to Christ. So don't sleep on it. And you have a calling that is the same as us, which is to, again, worship and reflect God, but you have a different passion and different talent set. So that can be unveiled in the service of God.
And you touched on a really good point, which is if you are struggling with that, I think you should sit down with somebody, sit down with a pastor, sit down with somebody who's an elder in the faith in your life, you know, that you trust, and to say, these are the things I like to do. What is the common thread in that? Because I agree. I think that you have to almost get down to the root, and it takes a little while. It's like an onion where you have to peel it back and go, well, I like to do this, and I like to do this, and I'm passionate about this. And it's like, but if you can find that common thread, then it makes it a lot easier for you to find fulfillment and move through things, because you might even find that something that you're like, oh, I hate my job. But if you get to the root of, but I love people, it's like, okay, well, then how do you channel that at your job and do your calling in your vocation?
yeah.
For
so
real.
yeah, it's your calling is always going to draw other people to Christ as you pursue Christ, right? It's that thing that God created you uniquely for within the body of Christ to build the kingdom. And again, sometimes that's directly correlated to what you do in your career, and sometimes it's not. Oftentimes it's not.
Yeah.
And so, like, I supervised people in a massive warehouse, right? And just kind of guided them through their daily activities and made sure things functioned for a business. They paid me to do that, which then enabled me to have the finances to invest in a church, and then the resources and the skill set that this company was training me to know how to deal with people and manage people. And then I took that skill set and applied it into ministry, into my calling. And so they oftentimes work together.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that hasn't intersected yet, but who you are now, and I know you've grown since there, but like, I just know you and I'm going, I highly doubt that there weren't any seeds sown in that job. Like,
Oh, yeah.
you love people. You love to minister to people, talk to people, be there for people in big areas of their life, like births and things like you love to be there for people in those moments. So I'm sure that you were applying some of that deeper calling in your job, even if you were at the time even unaware of it.
Yeah, so I just had a conversation with somebody who used to attend. It used to be called Indian Creek Community Church. That's not the name any longer, but in Olathe, and they used to attend there. And I just had a conversation with them, and I asked if they knew this guy, and they said, "Oh yeah, I know him." And I said, "When I worked in a warehouse and I was picking orders, I worked side by side with him, and I shared the gospel with him, and we just did life. We spent a lot of time together,
Yeah.
and we got to a point where his mom was dying of cancer." And he knew my faith because we had talked, and he said, "Hey, could you pray for me and pray for my mom?" And I said, "What's going on?" And so he told me, and we prayed. And I walked with him through that journey. One night after work, so we worked weird hours, and we worked a night shift, and we got off at 1 a.m. And I said, "Hey, do you have a few minutes?" And so he came to my house, and we sat on my front porch and we talked outside at 1 a.m. And we had a long conversation about what it means to follow Jesus. He did not accept Christ that night, but a few weeks later, I prayed with him. He received Christ, changed his life. He then became a very significant servant at Indian Creek. He wasn't in full-time ministry,
Right.
but he served faithfully there. And it was because of my career
Yeah.
that was kind of cultivating these things that produced something bigger that then led to my ultimate
Right.
calling as a pastor. So,
Well, I think that people listening to this, everybody thinks that if I can just get my friend to their pastor, I'm like, no, you are in your
Right.
context. You have a
Yeah.
calling in your context.
that happened probably 8 to 10 years before I was ever in full-time ministry.
So we have about just a few minutes left. I want to ask about that though. What advice would you give to somebody who's listening to this? Because you challenged us to be more available to what God is doing in our lives. How do I become more available to what God wants to call me into? What is one thing that you would say, hey, if you're listening to this, if you want to have a story like that where no matter what you're doing, your coworker, somebody you regularly interact with, maybe even a client, that you get to share the gospel to them. So what is something that you can do to be more available to serve?
Yeah, so I mentioned that phrase, my availability gives God the opportunity to do a miracle through me. That was something that I learned, and I just talked with one of our elders, Randy Swearingen, this morning about that, because he and I went to that same church years ago. There was a guy named Ken Houts, and he came in and he did a teaching in our church about first impressions, basically, and outreach and evangelism. And that's his catchphrase that he used. I learned that before I was a full-time staff member at that church. I was just attending that church, and I just went to a training,
Right.
and it stuck with me. And I still use that today. So, like, if you're not in full-time ministry, which is the vast majority of people, that you're not a pastor,
Yeah.
God still has a calling on your life. So make yourself available. Just go to the teachings, go to the places where ministry is happening and say, here I am,
Yeah.
send me. And God will use you in incredible ways. And who knows, you might wind up being a pastor someday.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, I think for me it would be to encourage a mindset shift. First, that you are not serving us. You're not
Yeah.
serving Pastor Rick or Pastor Lucas or any of us. We just happen to have avenues in which you can serve, and so we're trying to, I don't know, kickstart that engine if you aren't serving. And that other mind shift is that there's an old Petra song that says, like,
Oh no.
I am available. That's what the whole song is about. I will go when you say go. And so shifting to that servanthood is not a hat or a name tag you put on, right? It is a 24/7, 365 lifestyle of servanthood. So whether you are miserable at your job in an office or retail or in food industry, your service there should look the same as when you are serving, if you are serving in the church, greeting at the door. Your heart should always be for people or for God first and then for people. And so I think that is the key, is that having a mindset shift that you are always a servant, and that should keep you from feeling like, I can't serve right now. I just got all this other stuff going on. It never stops. And if you can, shift it to where like, this is my calling, is to serve. And even though this is my title over here, I don't take any hat off of that servant. I'm always a servant of God. I'm always a servant of the church. I'm always looking forward to meeting people and changing their lives. And like you said with your story, which was awesome, it wasn't because you did the work. It was because you were obedient, and God paved the way for you and had a life change with that person. We talk about that all the time. It's not, people, your testimony has the impact, but Jesus does the work. So just keep serving, and 24/7, never take that hat off. Just let that become who you are.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this before, I think even on the podcast, I don't remember, but when I worked in that warehouse job, and again, I was there 15 years, so I knew people, and my life was my life. I wasn't two different people. And my nickname by a couple of people there was Oral Roberts. Like, they just called me Oral Roberts because that was the spiritual person that they knew from TV or whatever.
Oral Roberts University.
Yeah. And so they would, if they needed me in the office on the intercom, it would be Oral Roberts, come to the office, please. Yeah. And they were like, it was just, and to me, it was like, at least they know where I stand.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely. It was a compliment to me. They were poking fun at me, but they knew, because I lived it in front of them. It was ministry, whether there or in the church. And because of that, then I was able to lead Kirk to the Lord and watch him grow in his faith and go to a church. It wasn't the church that I went to, wasn't a church that I was a part of leadership. He went to a church that God led him to, and he was an effective servant there. And it was a joy to watch him grow and mature. But it was simply because I said, I'm available in the church and outside of the church.
A little persecution means you're doing the right thing.
Exactly.
Just a little touch.
Just a little bit.
Persecution is just recognition.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
But yeah, I agree with all that. Like I said, I think that my best advice is, because like what you're talking about is what the Bible talks about, being a city on a hill. It's about being a light, that darkness doesn't overcome light. When the light shines, the darkness flees. And so I would just encourage you, if you're listening to this, to, and if you're listening to this, you're probably already halfway there because you're doing something outside the Sunday morning experience. But you have to refuel yourself so that you are a light. You know, it's just like, if you're like, oh, I hate my job, I'm just beaten down. You need to refill yourself with Christ. Have the Holy Spirit, radiating in your life. Then whether you're at the pool or at the baseball game or at your job, you are the light in the darkness. It's not that the darkness is overcoming you.
Yeah, you're fulfilling your calling, and then as he calls you deeper, then your calling expands. And,
Well, with that sound of a flood and rain coming in through the podcast, it's time to go, but we'll hopefully see you guys here next week on the 167. If you enjoyed this episode of the 167, make sure you like, subscribe, follow, get notified, leave a 5-star rating and a positive review. Tell all your friends to listen as well. Make sure you go over to newlifegardener.com and check out all that we have to offer as a church, and check out our messages online as well. Thanks for listening.